We're really excited to be here tonight, and before we get started, I just wanted to get a few housekeeping notes out of the way. I first wanted to thank St. Anne's for allowing us to use their space for this event. If you need to use the restroom at any point, they're through the doors on my right, in the far corner of the next room. At the end of the talk, we'll be doing an audience Q&A via a line in the center aisle. We'll let you know once it's time to start lining up for that. I know many of you picked up a book with your ticket, but we'll have additional copies of Maggie's and Leslie's books available for purchase where you checked in. Maggie will be signing and personalizing books at the end of the show. We'll let you know when and where to start lining up for that. If you're joining us on the live stream tonight, we encourage you to buy a copy of You Could Make This Place Beautiful via the link in the live stream description. Tonight, it's my privilege to introduce Maggie Smith, who joins us tonight in conversation with Leslie Jamison to celebrate the release of You Could Make This Place Beautiful, a lush and heart-trending memoir exploring coming of age in your middle age. You Could Make This Place Beautiful is an unflinching look at what it means to live and write our own lives. It is a story about a mother's fierce and constant love for her children and a woman's love and regard for herself. Above all, this memoir is an argument for possibility. With a poet's attention to language and an innovative approach to the genre, Smith reveals how, in the aftermath of loss, we can discover our power and make something new, something beautiful. Maggie Smith is the award-winning author of Good Bones, The Well Speaks of Its Own Poison, Lamp of the Body, and the national bestsellers Goldenrod and Keep Moving. A 2011 recipient of a Creative Writing Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, Smith has also received several individual excellence awards from the Ohio Arts Council, 2 Academy of American Poets Prizes, a Pushcart Prize, and fellowships from the Sustainable Arts Foundation and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She's been widely published, appearing in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Paris Review, the Best American Poetry, and more. As I mentioned earlier, Maggie will be joined in conversation tonight by Leslie Jamison. Leslie Jamison is the author of the New York Times bestsellers The Recovering and the Empathy Exams and the novel The Gym Closet. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, and her work has appeared in publications including The Atlantic, Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, as well as others. She directs the graduate nonfiction program at Columbia University and lives in Brooklyn with her family. Without further delay, please give a very warm welcome to Maggie and Leslie.
Just before I even get to start talking to Leslie about this book, and I'm not going to cry before I remember to thank the people I need to thank. Goodness, this has been a long time coming. I want to thank my editor, Julia, who is wearing almost the exact same thing as me today, and we've done this on more than one occasion. Completely not planned, and I don't know how that happened, but it makes me feel very New York to be an Ohioan dressing like a New York editor. So thanks for making me feel cool. Libby, thank you, and nice to meet you. Joanna, Abby, Nick, Lisa, Wendy, Jimmy, who we have to thank for this cover art, which I still can't get over, and I just want the words inside to live up to the cover. Dana, Suzanne, Morgan, Dana, Jonathan Carter, Joy, because Joy is always on time, Leslie, and everyone in Books Are Magic, and St. Anne's, thanks, and for you for being here, thanks so much.
It's so great to be here with you, Maggie.
Oh,
This beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book you've written. It is truly, I was saying to you backstage in a church.
Backstage in the vestibule.
In the vestibule. It's a gift. It's a gift to all of us from here. It's a gift to the world, and it's wonderful to be here celebrating with you. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And maybe you're going to read a little bit.
Yeah. So, book, which is the very, very beginning. It's only a page and a half. And then we'll talk a bit. Can you hear me okay in the back? Yes, okay. Oh, I love this. Thumbs. Oh, nice. Hello. Prologue. Before we go any further together, me with my lanterns, you following close behind, light flickering on both of our faces, I want to be clear about something. This isn't a tell-all. A tell-all would need an omniscient narrator, godlike, hovering over the whole scene, seeing into the houses, listening to the conversations and phone calls, reading the texts and emails. I'm jealous of this all-knowing narrator, even though she doesn't exist. I want to know what she knows. This isn't a tell-all because all is something we can't access. We don't get all. Some, yes. Most, if we're lucky. All, no. There is no such thing as a tell-all, only a tell-some, a tell-most, maybe. This is a tell-mine, and the mine keeps changing because I keep changing. The mine is slippery like that. This isn't a tell-all because some of what I'm telling you is what I don't know. I'm offering the absences too. The spaces I know aren't empty, but I can't see what's inside them. Like the white spaces between stanzas in a poem, what is unspoken, unwritten there? How do we read those silences? The book you're holding in your hands was many books before it was this one. Nested inside this version are the others, the version I began deep inside my sadness, thumbed into my phone in bed on sleepless nights, the one I scribbled out with sparks in my hair. You'll see pieces of those books inside this one. Why? Because I'm trying to get to the truth, and I can't get there except by looking at the whole, even the parts I don't want to see, maybe especially those parts. I've had to move into and through the darkness to find the beauty. Spoiler alert, it's there. The beauty's there. I know the real people who are part of this story, the story of my life, may read it. Most importantly, my children may read this book someday. Hi kids, I love you. I share this story with them because we share the life. But this tell-mine is just that, my experience. There's no such thing as a tell-all because we can only ever speak for ourselves. Where do I begin? I could begin in my childhood. I could begin in a college classroom where I sat across from the man I would later marry, or in a Denny's on State Route 23 where we wrote private jokes on the sugar packets, or in our first apartment in Grandview where I was hit by lightning the night we moved in, or in the hospital where my children were born and I was born and my mother was born, or on our last family vacation when I packed my sadness and took it with us to the beach, or in my lawyer's office rubbing a small, sharp piece of rose quartz under the conference table, or at the end of everything, that was also somehow the beginning. Or in this moment, writing to you, watching fog skim the roofs of houses across the street, as if the clouds had grown tired of treading air and had let themselves sink, or. This story could begin in any of those places. I'm beginning here.
Thank you so much for beginning there. And it's perfect not only to get to hear the start of this book and get an introduction to this voice that carries us through these chapters and these pages, but one of the questions that I was most excited to ask you about is connected to that moment where you talk about the other books that live inside this book, the previous books, the book you wrote from inside the depths of sadness, like thumbed out on the cell phone in the middle of the night, the book you wrote with sparks in your hair. And I'd love to ask you about, both kind of, if you could tell us something about those other versions, what you find characterizes the voice of those versions, like the form of those versions, like the kinds of things that show, the kinds of truths that were illuminated to you, writing from sadness, writing from anger, and how you kind of did the work of figuring out what are the shards of those raw, more immediate versions that belong in this final version?
Yeah, the editing process was intense because I wrote a lot more, as we all do, right? You write a lot more than you're ever going to use. And for this book, I wrote a lot more really heavy, emotional material that I knew, like, no, that's not going in the book. No, that's not going in the book. And so I really wanted to be measured, as measured as I could be, and honest. And so there is anger in the book, but I was able to sort of like find the pieces I wanted to share and then leave some out that I didn't feel like needed to be for public consumption. And there is sadness in the book, but not as much as I felt. Although having said that, when my dad read the book for the first time, he messaged me and said, "I didn't realize how much pain you were in." And I thought, oh, maybe I didn't scrub out enough of the sadness from the book, because clearly there's still a lot in there. But yeah, the editing process was really one of sort of curating this like gallery of paintings, right? Like I wrote each piece individually, which you probably can feel. And then, and I worked on it with Megan Steelstra, a friend of ours, at first, and literally used markers, like color-coded markers, to figure out how I wanted to thread all of these things together. And a lot of that was about the emotional weather. And that's poetry too. You know, when I'm arranging a poetry collection, I'm always thinking tonally, what are we coming out of this poem feeling? And then what is the next poem, how is it beginning? And tonally, what is that entrance going to be like for the reader? Is it too jarring? Do I need something else there? Like, what are these sort of transitions? And the same thing sort of tonally and emotionally within this book, which is probably why the first third is so sad.
Well, and I think, I don't know, yeah, and I think there's probably that effect too when people from your life read the book where there's just such a strong desire to console every moment of pain that they find. And I think it's fascinating to hear you talk about the kind of emotional weather of each piece in here, and thinking about the book as a whole as a kind of landscape that you're asking your reader to traverse, and it has all of these microclimates in the landscape, and you're moving them from microclimate to microclimate. And some of the moments of, it seems to me that some of the moments where there is some vertigo or something jarring in a transition are beautiful and truthful, because that's also what life is, and what this life, you know, as a reader coming to it, part of what it held too, is like you move from, especially when you have kids, you move from intense sadness to like an incredible moment. And there actually isn't necessarily always a buffer. They're just both there happening at once. And the form of the book gives us that at onceness too, in this really powerful, formal way. So
At onceness, I love that. At onceness.
well,
Yeah.
it's part of the poetry of this book, I think. And I was going to ask about form actually, and how you came to the structure of this book, these titled sections that each, you know, that we have certain recurring threads that we come back to, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your color coding and those markers and what the colors were and what the threads were that you were arranging. But I also wonder if it took you a while to find that this was going to be the form, these short pieces, their titles, the categories and kinds of pieces that show up here, or what the journey was like to arrive at this as the structure of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I write small. If you know my poems, you know that they like almost never even hit a second page. I'm really like congratulating myself when I get to page 2 of a Word document. Like, is this what they mean by the long poem? It's not. They actually mean like a book-length poem, which I think would be like the challenge of my life, like an epic. I tend to write small, and I'm a whittler. So as I revise things, I'm always thinking about what is essential and what can be taken away. So as I revise, I'm almost never adding anything. I'm always taking away. And in fact, the first draft of this book was longer than the final. And it was a lot about cutting and cutting. And so I think I knew going in thought the only way I could write this book as myself, which is to say as a poet, would be to write very small over and over, rather than trying to sort of think of it as a wide landscape I had to tackle like all at once. And so I knew that they would probably be vignettes. I had no idea what the recurring strands would be because I just had to start writing to see what might want to repeat. You know, everything only happens once, and then it's like, actually, I feel like at this point I need to do that thing again. Oh, I'm feeling a tug to return to that, or I feel like I need to talk back to the section I just wrote. Like on second thought, 3 pages back I said this. But really, I'm reconsidering that at this moment, so let's just in real time have. So that was very organic. The color coding was actually Megan's suggestion. She said, I think there are all these different strands in the book, and the way to get balance is to give each strand a color. So what are the strands? The questions, the forward-moving narrative, the flashback, the italicized sections that are sort of me grappling with what the perfect metaphor for this experience might be, and not quite landing on one, so I'm trying them all on over and over again. And so color coding it, and then like literally, Leslie, like printing out hundreds of pages, color coding them, and then shuffling them around on the floor, and feeling like what feels intuitively right after this blue page. I think we need this pink. I think we need this green. It was a mess.
I'm just like right now in my mind, I have a picture of my 5-year-old just like breaking into the room and just like just as I've got just as I've got the perfect structure. It's like, oh, I moved all the colors are together now.
I sorted it for you, Mom.
Totally. Well, I was thinking about, so one of these strands, each one is titled, A Friend Says Every Book Begins with an Unanswerable Question, and then we get a series of unanswerable questions. The one I'm looking at right now is where did it go? And we also have how it will, we sort of, the questions constitute their own plot line in a way. And I love that because, you know, when I teach, I often talk to my students about what I constantly need to keep learning, which is like part of the work is always finding your questions, finding the engine of your questions. And I wonder, how much did you have to write your way towards even knowing what your questions were? How did you find your questions? Were some of your questions that you knew because you lay awake with them every night in the middle of the night, and other questions were questions that surprised you along the way? Like, what was the kind of journey to finding the moments of this strand?
Yeah, so I did an event, I think for Goldenrod, my last book of poems, with the poet Tiana Clark. And during our conversation, she said, every book begins with an unanswerable question. And like during our live Zoom, I was jotting that down on a piece of paper on my desk, and I thought, okay, because I'm writing this book. So what are mine? Or what is mine? Is there one central unanswerable question? Is there a list of unanswerable questions? And so I kind of made myself this list. And in the first draft of the book, it was one chapter, and it was a list of questions. And then I like the idea of letting them live on their own, I think because, and I don't know what your impression of it is, but to me, having them live on their own sandwiched between 2 other bits, allowed them to sort of ping and sort of be in conversation off of those specific choices. So like, you know, when you make a playlist, it's like, well, I'm going to slide this in here because it kind of references what the sort of thematic stuff of this area. And some of that thematic stuff, for lack of a better word, was getting lost in the list.
Yeah, no, I love granting each one kind of their own page, both because that way they get all this space around them that they can kind of cast a shadow over, and they help us or suggest ways we might read the sections that are right around them. And also I think it's almost like putting them in a list gives us relief too quickly from each one by moving us to the next, and this way we really live in them with you. We hold on to them, or they hold on to us as we move through
White
the
space is
pages.
good for that, right? Like white space is like, I always think of this as a poet, like it's the literal breathing room. And so when you work white space into a piece of writing, well, depending on how you look at it or the kind of reader you are, you're either forcing or inviting the reader to spend time reflecting on what you've just offered them before they have to like rush into the next thing.
Yeah.
And I liked using white space in this book to sort of, I'm going to hand you something. I'm not going to actually over-explain it or maybe even say as much as you would like me to say about it, but I'm going to hand it to you, and then I'm going to kind of step away and give you a little space with it, and then moving on. We'll do something else.
Yeah, and I think there's an intimacy that comes out of asking, inviting, sort of something stronger than that, maybe like creating the conditions by which a reader lives in those questions with you, and it's an intimacy that I think is related to what you were talking about earlier when you were talking about sort of allowing sections to speak back to a section 3 pages prior where we feel you thinking in real time on the page and thinking about, well, that's not the full story because I also want to say this, or I also want to make sure you don't just see this part that was painful, but also this part that was full of love. And I think there's an intimacy in that, in dramatizing that kind of, not necessarily quite self-correction on the page, but addition or reflection or thinking back. We feel like we're with you in your thinking mind and in your kind of reckoning process. And in that, I wanted to ask you about the epigraph, which is another kind of being with, and it shows up, its metaphor shows up in the first sentence of the prologue as well, but it's from Emily Dickinson. I'm out with lanterns looking for myself. And I wondered, first of all, I love that framing of thinking about the self as something that is not possessed or known, but something that must be looked for over and over and over again. And I guess I'm asking what you found when you went out looking for yourself, I mean, which is this book, but more specifically, maybe what surprised you? What were the parts of yourself that you didn't know fully until you wrote this book, or the parts of the story that you didn't know fully until you wrote this book? What kind of ambushed you or took you by surprise along the way?
You know, I think one of the things I realized is, and I joked about this in the book, that one of the things I found myself doing after my divorce was listening to music from the early to mid-90s, sort of obsessively. And I realized that it was maybe because I was sort of trying to reset myself to like a factory setting, like a pre-marriage factory setting.
Yeah.
Right? Like who was I in the before times? Like if there was a before this and an after this, who was I in the before times? And the me in the before times would have been, right, like in the mid-90s, what did I listen to? What did I like?
Can you tell us a couple of those songs?
Oh yeah, so I mean, I went through this period of time. Well, and to be fair, I'm like maybe deeply uncool, and I listen to mostly like 90s and 2000s indie rock anyway. So my regular rotation is like Superchunk and Pavement and Pixies and Replacements, but I was also going like a little deeper, and I was like, I'm gonna pull out the Sundays, I'm gonna pull out Sugar Cubes, I'm gonna like Bjork, like I'm gonna pull out all the stuff that was like Uncle Tupelo, like my Liz Phair, my favorite like high school, college stuff. And I think it was about self-recovery. Like, who was I before this? And I mean, it's funny. If you write enough about divorce, you become kind of a divorce expert. And like, people will slide into your DMs to tell you they're getting divorced, or will like want your advice about things sort of related to divorce. And one of the pieces of advice I found myself giving to people over and over was like, you don't forget that you predate this. Like you weren't born into this relationship. Like you predate this. There is a you that existed before this person, and there is a you who exists post this person. There is a continuity of self, and maybe what you need to do is like remember who that person was. And so some of that, like being out with
Yeah,
lanterns,
yeah.
looking for myself, was not even necessarily finding a lot of new stuff out about myself. It was about like, what pieces had I kind of like stuffed away or let go of or not really honored, you know? You know, what did several years of sort of grief kind of dampen in me? And one of those things is like my sense of humor, like really trying to lean into my wicked sense of humor.
Yeah.
Because if you can't laugh,
No, and this book is it's funny, and it's funny. I was thinking about the humor in this book when you were talking about emotional weather and how I think fickle weather systems remind us of how much relief comes. You know, that sun feels a particular way after rain that it couldn't have felt if the rain hadn't happened. And I think humor in this book works like that, because it's never the humor of deflection or turning away. It's always the humor that comes when you look closely enough at something that its truth is just right there and so absurd but also so funny. Yeah. Right, I just cursed, I'm sure. Brought me to this point,
it's
Maggie.
okay, I know. I have that effect on people somehow.
Well, I was gonna ask you, and it's really stems from what we were just talking about. I was gonna ask you to read one more page from here, a particular page from this section called the Intangibles. But I think it's connected to humor and retrieval and what you find when you go out with your lanterns, because part of what I love about this book is that nobody is allowed to be uncomplicated in this book. Everybody is granted the dignity of complexity, which is one of the things I think we owe people, not sainthood or whitewashing, but the dignity of complexity. And you also grant marriage the dignity of being many things at once, a site of joy as well as pain, a site of humor, a site of knownness, and a site of kind of daily truths, and you honor so fully how intimacy lives in those like daily particulars, and that's part of what I love about this section. So.
Well, I realized opening the book to this section, right before it is a quote from Rachel Cusk. I've become an exile from my own history. Talk about factory settings, wanting to get back. This chapter is called The Intangibles. You know what one of the saddest damn things is? One of the parts of all of this that I'm grieving the most? When I lost my marriage, I lost all that shared history. I lost the person who knew me in a way no one else does. And when I lost him, I also lost being known like that. Megan, my therapist, looked at me through the screen. She nodded but didn't speak. She knew me well enough to know I was going to keep talking. I mean, it's all the little things, I said. The private jokes and made-up songs and silly voices and comedy bits we'd do. I didn't tell her that on taco night, we'd sing Taco Night to the tune of the Village People's Macho Man. I didn't tell her that my husband used to tell me that he loved me mucho, mucho, or that he addressed my letters and cards to Martha from George, because one of our favorite films was Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. The irony of that film being about a dysfunctional marriage would not have been lost on Megan. All of that shared history, all of that institutional knowledge from my marriage, what do I do with it? What do I do when a little piece from my old life floats to the surface and bobs there right in front of my face? Who do I tell? Who do I laugh with or sing along with? She nodded. So, how does it make you feel in the moment when you remember something like that? How do you handle it? I don't know how I feel. Sad, swindled, cheated out of something. There's no joint custody for intangibles. We can't just divide them up like dishes or artwork. There's no selling off memories and splitting the proceeds. Who is awarded Lyle Lovett's Nobody Knows Me? It was our wedding song. I wanted it, but it wasn't mine to keep. Who gets to claim the cliffs of Moore, or the road winding along Oak Creek between Sedona and the Grand Canyon, or the frantic run to catch the train to Paris? I didn't ask her because I knew the answer. We both get everything and nothing at all, And that, I tell her, is the saddest damn thing.
So good, so good. And yeah, it makes me think about something that my friend Mary Carr once said about writing divorce, that you don't write the pain of divorce by writing how hard the divorce was. You write it by writing the love that was there. And I think it's so powerful, the ways that you also make room for that love. Well, I have a ton more questions, but I'll ask a few more, and then I know that there are many questions for you here. There's one moment, like one kind of moment where, I don't know, as a writer of nonfiction, there are like certain times when life just like gives you something, and you're like, if I was a fiction writer,
You could
use it.
It's too on the nose.
Yeah, but then it happens, and then there it is to write. But I was thinking about that there's a moment when your divorce lawyer quits, and your dentist, or your divorce lawyer retires, and your dentist retires, and the one was leading to some problems with the other. These were connected. Their impact was connected. But you end with this incredible image of, which I'm sure was also painful as a human to live through, but of, having kind of ground down some of your teeth, and that in moments of focusing or concentrating, you would run your tongue along the rough edges. And I was thinking about that also as a way of describing something about the creative process, where there's a way that part of what I think my favorite writing does is try to run our expression or articulation along the rough edges of experience, the stuff that we haven't managed to smooth into a coherent story or a thesis statement or a takeaway yet. And I wondered if you could talk about that as part of this process. Were there certain aspects of their experience? I mean, in a certain way, it was all rough edges. There were so many rough edges here, but things where you felt like, God, I'm really trying to write into something that I haven't figured out. It's not smooth to me. It's somehow troubling and vexed and confounding. And how was that kind of writing part of this project?
Yeah, I love that you found a metaphor in my literal experience of running my teeth around my teeth that I grind down out of stress. I'm like, how can the divorce lawyer and the dentist retire at the same time? I need both of them so much right now. Yeah, I love that, the idea of sort of like working over the sort of grit and trying to figure that out. I will say most of this book was me running my tongue over the rough edges. And, I was thinking about this recently. If I wrote this book in 20 years, I don't think it would be in the same way. I might not actually have any of the answers I don't have now.
Right.
But I would probably feel different about it in that sort of like way after time. And I think in some ways we also have a kind of cultural obsession with before and after. And that kind of transformation, before I didn't know.
Totally. Yeah.
Right? Before I didn't know and I didn't have it figured out. And then in the course of writing this book, living this life, getting remarried, whatever the thing is, I figured it out. And now I'm a butterfly. And I think we love that, and it's comforting.
Right.
I would like to be a butterfly. I am a caterpillar. And so...
Caterpillar listening to Liz Fair.
I am a Liz Fair listening caterpillar. Yeah, so I think, maybe we are all just sort of in the middle for a long time. And maybe we're just a little further along in the middle. And a lot of that is about not knowing. And actually, I read about this, but it reminds me of something Stan Plumley used to always tell me about poems, which are poems begin in the middle and end later in the middle. Right? That's what poems are. They're not actually, you can't sort of snip them off neatly and well, that's a packaged bit. And so I think, part of the writing of this book and the style of the writing of this book, which is talking directly to the reader, second-guessing myself, kind of turning back on some things and reconsidering, was about me trying to kind of show the edges.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also, as I was reading this, felt so, for many reasons, like directly spoken to by that you. And I wonder if that was always a part of the book, that kind of direct address of the reader, and either way, if it was always part of the DNA of this book, or if it was something you sort of found partway along the way, I wonder both what you feel that direct address to the reader allowed you to say, or how it allowed you to speak that might not have been possible without it, and also whether you sort of find yourself imagining any particular kind of reader either in an emotional way, like somebody who might need to hear something in these pages, whatever that something was, and maybe that something is often even beyond your knowing, or just in what terms you sort of, the reader feels such intimacy with you on the receiving end, but what you felt with or from or toward the reader as you were writing.
Yeah, generosity, I think, like generosity of spirit. It was part of the book from the very beginning. It's in the prologue. I mean, I really, focusing my attention on this book, I knew I was going to be vulnerable in the material, and so I wanted to also be vulnerable and intimate in the telling, in the actual writing, and to sort of like not have a bunch of artifice about, and polish and gloss. I didn't want to pretend. I wanted to be myself. If I was going to be myself, I wanted to be able to be my whole self in the book. And I don't know that I had like a specific reader in mind, although someone today said to me, "This is the book I didn't know I needed." And I love that. And I thought, maybe that's my ideal reader, is the person who picks it up and doesn't know they need it. And it's like, oh, yes, okay. Whether it's, as a sort of permission slip in content, or a permission slip in form, or, how are you going to structure a story? Yeah, it's for the person who doesn't know that they need it.
I love that so much. I think that it's time to hear some of the many questions that I'm sure live in this holy room for you.
Incredible space.
So, go ahead, and there's this mic right in the center of the aisle.
Don't be shy. It probably feels strange to walk down the aisle of a church to a microphone. I just think we should acknowledge that, but you shouldn't feel shy. Just pretend you're not at a microphone in a church.
Hi, I'm right here next to it, so
That's not scary. Excellent.
First of all, I love both your writing so much. And Maggie, I just wanted to ask, at the beginning you were talking about how when you were making cuts, you tried to cut out a lot of the saddest parts. Why did you want to cut out the sadness, I guess is what I'd ask.
Well, okay, so let me slightly rephrase, as I do in the book. On second thought, maybe it's not that I took out the saddest parts, I wanted the book to feel balanced. That for me was important. And so I didn't, the book reflects my life, but not perfectly. If the book reflected my life, it would be, 300 pages of crying, 100 pages of laughter, and that doesn't actually work as art. And so there has to be some curation in that. And so I did try to pull back on some of those things, because I did want there to be moments of levity in the book. I did want there to be sort of like my whole self in the book. I wanted fun times with my kids to be in there. I wanted my roller skating escapades to be in there. And I couldn't segue into any of that from just 30 pages of crying. So I tried to spare the reader from some of that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Maybe there are. It's like, this is a bravery test. So much respect, honestly, much respect.
I'm totally that person who asks questions. I was curious, sort of going off of that question, if it was therapeutic for you in some sort of way to cut out sort of parts of the sadness that maybe
you. I would not say it was therapeutic to cut some of those pieces out of the book because I was not able to edit them out of the life. Oh, that's my gallows sense of humor. If only I could just redline all of that. That's not how it works. And so no, sort of like pulling things out of the book didn't actually sort of remove them from my experience. It probably made reading the audiobook more enjoyable. Yeah, that was interesting. The book writing itself as therapeutic, I mean, in some ways, yes, right? Because I was able, and I tried to describe this to someone recently, and I'm not sure I did a great job, but I'll try to describe it in the same way to you, and you can grade me A tab. Or plus equal sign squiggle line, which is what my children get as grades. I think it's like meeting, exceeding, not meeting expectations, or arriving at, pulling into the station of expectations. I said it's sort of like writing a memoir, writing this book for me was sort of like the first time I went to France. And I got there and I was like, wow, what a beautiful place. And then I came home and I think only later did I really sort of look at a map and take in where I had been and how close to every other place I had been. Like I was that close to Spain when I was there because in my head I was just in France because I was 20, right? And so something about writing a memoir was for me therapeutic in that it was so deeply contextualizing about different times of my life and different facets of my life that it allowed me to sort of be a cartographer in that way and spread the whole map out. Is this making sense as a metaphor? And see like, oh, this is how my work life relates to my parenting life. This is how my parenting life relates to my life as someone's partner. This is how my friendships play into all of this. And I don't know that I would have had the opportunity to sort of see how all those things touch in such a deep way had I not gathered everything between two covers.
It's really fascinating. I give it a plus.
Okay, thank you. I thought a squiggle, but I'll take a plus.
Hi, first of all, Dan's on stage.
Hi, Dan.
Good
Good to see you.
So my question, I guess, goes back to the curation idea that came up. And I'm going to use a very cynical verb, it's the pet parent in me, but
Okay.
I'm curious to hear about the deployment of your children in the book.
Deployment.
I know, it's very cynical, I know.
Boots on the ground.
Yeah, but I do feel like there were choices that you made in terms of how and where and why to incorporate your children into the narrative. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, my therapist says boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. And I've sort of applied that to writing and life. And so my sort of like big hard line with deploying, I feel like I've like putting parachutes on them and sending them out of an army plane over a hostile landscape. Of writing about the kids in the book was not writing about their interior lives, like not writing about their emotional experiences so much. So everything else was fair game. If it's like us hanging out and us going and doing this and us having a conversation about this thing, that felt safe and fine to me. And if it was something where we had a conversation that felt intimate, that's not for the book, because maybe in time they might write their own. I don't get to steal their material. That feels like just like highway robbery, you know. So no, I think my impulse really with them was more protective than anything else, but also they're such a huge part of my life. I spend much more time parenting than I do writing. I spend more time parenting than I do anything else. And so I couldn't actually write a book about my life in which like there were these sort of, you know, do you remember those old-fashioned photos where the mother would hold the child draped in a black sheet? Right? Because they didn't have like those little bumbo chairs where you could prop a baby up. So if you wanted to get a photo of your infant way, way long time ago. The mother, look this up on the internet, you all. It is the creepiest thing. It literally is it's a photo of a mother draped in a black sheet. You can just see like the outline of a human being holding an infant for the photo. And that's not how life is. Like, we're in it together all the time. Like, we're experiencing all of this together. So I tried to honor that as much as I could and not drape either one of us under a black sheet. Thank you. Hello.
So they often say healing isn't linear, and hearing the way that you broke down your individual shorter pieces, color coding it, moving them all around, yet knowing that there's more of an arc to a story. Did you find sort of a chronological tendency in your in how you place this?
Yeah, I think there's like I would say the spine of the book is chronological, starting at the beginning and moving toward the end, and then other things kind of like leaf around it, like the other threads leaf around it. I don't remember what color the sort of chronological spine was. Maybe blue, that seems sensible. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, they say healing isn't narrative because that's true. Like, our healing isn't linear because that's true. I mean, you do feel better, I think, over time, but it's sometimes 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, right? And some of the shape of this book is because I don't think memory works in a linear way either. I think of memory as sort of like a web, right? Like, you hear a song, which reminds you of somewhere you were when you heard that song, which reminds you of the person you were with when you were doing that, which reminds you of this other person that person reminds you of, which reminds you of that sweater they never gave you back, which reminds you of the time you wore the sweater. And so it's kind of a, like a network memory. Rumination, which I know a lot about, and so does my dentist. That's what makes me grind my teeth, the sort of going over things in one's mind. I think of that being the sort of shape of a spiral. It's not just a circle, because you are moving forward in time, but you're moving forward in time and still kind of considering and trying to process and think about the same things over and over. Hence, the return of certain chapter titles, the return of certain images, because you're going to come back around to it even as you're moving forward. And for me, grief is waves. Like, grief is just like that one you don't see coming because you've made the mistake of turning your back to it when you're out there bobbing in the ocean, and then it smacks you in the face, and you have to sort of gather yourself, and then maybe it's like ebbs and it's kind of comfortable and you can kind of stay on top of it for a while, and then the vertigo feeling because you never really see it coming, because you'll hear a song or see a sweater or drive past a location, and something in that little memory thing and then the wave will hit you again. And so the narrative sort of structures of the book are really meant to get to the psychology of what the experience was. Yeah, I hope that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I love additional bravery. This makes me happy.
My question is not really just about this book, but about kind of your whole experience with putting out creative material into the world and having other people experience it and consume it, and obviously really you as a creative have this image of the work that you create. And what's that like, having other people, really resonate with it or really disagree with it, or just if you could talk a little bit about that, I'm curious.
I feel like we could answer this question together. I mean, it's
I
probably,
want to take notes on your answer.
no, I mean, it's probably what you imagine, which is when someone really gets it, it's this deep feeling of being seen and understood and feeling like it was worth all this, like the blood, sweat, and tears you put into building the thing. When you hand it to someone and they're like, oh, I see this thing you made and I understand it and it means something to me. There's sort of nothing better than that feeling. And then there is the feeling you have when someone either doesn't get it or willfully misunderstands you, and that is not a positive feeling. It is not a positive feeling, and I think, I don't know, what do we do to get through that? Like,
one of the things that I really resonated with in your book and loved was that you talk about friendship and community and, understand the self not as a singular voice, but as like a kind of quilt woven of all of these other voices. And I think in those moments for me, it's like, I'm not saving myself from anything. I'm not saving myself from furious indignation and righteousness and all of the, petty little arrows in my quiver. But other people in my life, I'm blessed to have this world of friends and a partner. I have these voices that can absorb it and remind me of what I need to hear. And, sometimes, when friends and students put books out, I also tell them, like, write down the nice shit that people say about this book where you felt like they got it, and then look at those and remember them. Make it tangible.
because you will remember the one snarky thing. That will live in your head forever, right? Like, people can tell you 300 really nice things, but the one really unkind thing someone says or asks or whatever will have real estate in your brain with a picket fence around it. No one else gets to move in forever. And I agree that especially having other writer friends who are doing this stuff and who get it, and you can call them and just be like, oh, this just happened. And they're like, oh, that happened to me once, listen to this. And maybe it's even worse than your story. And that kind of commiseration, and we don't just do that around writing, right? We do that around everything, around work, around parenting, around school. It's like when you have a bad day, or you get a bad review, or whatever happens, somebody ghosts you, or you have a breakup, you lean on your people. Yeah. Thank you. I love your dress.
Oh, thank you so much. Did you have any impulse to ask anybody for permission? And were you concerned with how your ex-husband would feel or what he would think that caused you anxiety, and how did you emotionally manage that?
I so respect and appreciate that question. No, I did not feel the need to ask anyone for permission. And I'm always concerned about I'm actually more concerned about how my kids will feel about this book when they're 30, frankly, because I love them to pieces. So I'm always concerned about how people will read themselves into a book. But ultimately, my sort of decision-making now is I can't let myself make decisions in my life based on fear or anxiety. They're kind of close cousins. Yeah. Oh, you want to borrow? Yeah.
Thank you guys. Thank you, Maggie and Leslie. That was a beautiful conversation. So we're going to give Maggie a moment to get settled, and then we're going to start the signing line at this table to my left. We're going to wrap that line down the center aisle. If you're interested in purchasing an additional copy, they're still for sale by the entrance. Thank you all for coming out tonight.